Et salut tout le monde, aujourd'hui je reçois Nick White de Celestia. On va parler un petit peu de DA, de l'adoption, de tout ce qu'il compte faire cette année autour de Celestia. How are you, Nick White?
Salut tout le monde. Je veux parler un peu français. I studied French in school, but
Amazing.
I think when it comes to talking about DA, I think it's better, and Celestia, I think it's better that I speak in English.
Yeah. Do you know how to say DA in French? In French?
DA, right?
Yeah, but yes, it's disponibilité des données. I think it's very hard in French.
Oh, it's in like the actual word.
Yeah.
Disponibilité de what?
Des
Say
données.
something again?
Data is
Okay,
données.
okay.
Yeah, it's very
That's
hard.
so tricky. So
Even myself.
it's DA as well, but it's not actually data availability. It's like, as in,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
it's but it just happens to be that it works the same way.
Very complicated.
That's cool.
Yeah. Can you first, introduce yourself, what you've done in the past, and what bring you to build the Celestia?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally studied electrical engineering and computer science, and was actually working in the AI industry for a little bit before. In 2017 and 2018, falling down the crypto rabbit hole, I co-founded a project called Harmony, which was a layer one sharding EVM-based chain in 2018. And then in 2020, I was still at Harmony, and I read this white paper called Lazy Ledger, and just completely floored me, and it just blew my mind, because it was the first real solution that I'd ever seen to scaling blockchains and simultaneously making blockchains more expressive and usable for developers and for people wanting to build applications. So for like 2 weeks after I read the white paper, I almost couldn't sleep, and I was just so excited. And so later that year, I got in touch with Mustafa, who wrote the paper and is one of the founders of Celestia, and just said, like, look, I really want to work on this because I think this is the future. So that's how I ended up joining the team in early 2021. And yeah, it's crazy that it's been over 4 years since then. But the time has just flown by, and I couldn't be more thrilled on where Celestia has come from just being an idea and a white paper to actually a fully implemented layer one protocol with securing hundreds of millions of dollars, soon to be billions, and powering, I think, which is like the next wave of the biggest applications in the industry. So yeah, that's kind of how I got here. Okay,
amazing. Can you explain a bit Celestia? I got a lot of questions about Celestia because it's kind of very different from what we know. Even this morning, I got someone that thought it was a rollup specialized in DA. So yeah, what is it? How does it work?
Yeah, so Celestia is a layer one blockchain. So I would think of it as very similar to Ethereum or Solana. So specifically, it is a layer one chain for building applications. However, it is very different from any layer one protocol that's come before it, in that it is modular, meaning that it doesn't have smart contracts or execution, like where you don't run the applications natively on the layer one protocol. You instead run your applications as a rollup, which is, I think a better maybe term for rollup is a vertically integrated application or a full stack application, because basically a rollup is very similar to a smart contract, except that you get way more control over the functionality, and you have way more ability to customize what you're building. And so Celestia is essentially a layer one that has been optimized for building full stack applications. Whereas like Ethereum or Solana have been optimized or originally were designed in a way to enable people to build smart contract applications. The thing is that smart contracts are very limited when someone has already defined for you the sequencing, someone's already defined the execution model, the economics, and the way the fees work, the RPCs, the wallets, and the cryptography. When all these things have already been defined for you, you, as an application developer, are very limited in the kinds of applications you can build, the kinds of functionality and features, the user experience. So we saw very early on that, the future of building Web3 applications would be these full stack applications. Every big idea, every big application is going to want to have this full level of control. So if you take that to the logical conclusion, you should redesign the L1 infrastructure to cater towards that. And that's essentially what Celestia does. So you don't build smart contracts, you build rollups, but everything else functionally is the same. So Celestia is a layer one with a consensus and validator set. People deploy applications, and what we need to scale then is not actually the execution of smart contracts, but data availability. And the beautiful thing about Celestia, so as I mentioned earlier, when I read the white paper, Celestia was solved two main problems. One was, how do you make applications better? And that's what I just explained, the full stack application stuff. And the second one's scaling, right? So everyone's always we've been trying for, over a decade now to scale these blockchain systems. And we keep running into the same bottlenecks. And the beauty of Celestia is that if you just focus only on scaling the data availability part, there's two kind of primary bottlenecks. Is the execution bottleneck, which is how do you actually run the smart contracts and update the state of these chains? And rollups kind of allow you to solve that by parallelizing these applications into separate sort of chains, virtual blockchains. But then you're still left with this problem. How do you scale this underlying L1 that the rollups run on top of? And you do that by scaling what's called data availability. And there's this new cryptographic primitive that Mustafa, one of the founders of Celestia, pioneered, called data availability sampling, where you can, for the first time, have sort of parallelized verification of the block space. So what this enables you to do is really scale the block space very aggressively, while still maintaining decentralization and verifiability, which is the core of what blockchains are all about. So Celestia is going to is able to absolutely push performance and throughput to levels that are just orders of magnitude beyond what we've seen on even previously considered high throughput blockchains. So recently we announced this Mammoth 1 testnet that is pushing out 128 megabyte blocks. So essentially it's our 21.33 megabytes per second of DA throughput. Now, what that means in practice to the audience is that's roughly 200,000 TPS, or essentially at the time when we released that would have been something I think over 10, maybe 20 or something, Solanas, equivalent of 20 Solana throughputs. So that's kind of the core value of Celestia is massive scale, horizontal scale at the base layer, vertical integration at the app layer. And that to me is just the future of where blockchain infrastructure and applications go from here.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree. You talk a lot about applications, so I think you're mostly bullish on app chains. Why do you think we keep seeing a lot of general purpose chain? Why don't we see that future? No?
Yeah, great question. So there's a few things that were holding it back, and continue to hold back, I would say, the full sort of domination of just app specific chains. The first was toolkits. Well, actually, there's maybe three. So the first was, and this kind of goes back to the origins of Cosmos. So I don't know if you and your audience are familiar with Cosmos, but it was the first ecosystem to come up with this idea that we should build, that the end game for applications is application specific blockchains. And they solved one of the really core bottlenecks to that, which is like, okay, we need like a good sort of like software framework for people to build these things. And so they built the Cosmos SDK, and they built this consensus software tendermint that made it really easy for anyone to deploy their own chain. So that was one big hurdle. However, what we found in practice was it was still orders of magnitude more difficult to deploy a application specific chain as it was to deploy a smart contract, right? And so it's easier to build a smart contract based application than to get a validator set, to issue a proof of stake token, to constantly maintain that network and upgrade it, and so on, versus like just pushing out code as a smart contract, integrating with, you know, an existing L1's sort of consensus. So one of the beautiful things that Celestia has done is it made it so that, and what rollups do is they enable you to have your own chain, but to have a virtual chain. So this is very similar to what you see in cloud computing architectures in the traditional internet, which is that instead of, we went from a sort of a paradigm of everyone that wanted to have their own server would have to build a physical server in their office. And then they could have like this fully integrated web application, right? They could kind of own their infrastructure, but that's a huge amount of CapEx, like a huge amount of overhead to build your own servers, right? So what happened is in cloud computing, we moved towards this virtualization route where I use Amazon's servers, their physical servers, but I deploy a virtual server on there that functionally is exactly the same as if I had my own server in my office, but I just don't have to go through all that effort. A rollup is very similar, where it's a virtual blockchain. So instead of deploying my blockchain as a standalone thing with its own validator set, which is kind of the equivalent amount of overhead as building your own physical servers, I can just use Celestia or Ethereum's existing network of validators and Blockspace and run a chain that it is in effect an independent chain. So basically what I'm saying is Celestia has removed the overhead of deploying your own application specific chain. So that was one thing that was holding the adoption of app chains back. The next thing was just straight up interoperability. So cross-chain interoperability remains a bottleneck to some degree, where, you know, if I deploy a new chain, the challenge is in blockchains, one of the value propositions is to have the ability for different blockchains and applications to interoperate with each other, for users from here with money over here to move that money to this other application, interact with it, and move back, or just basically have like a you know, an interoperable ecosystem of apps. This is very similar to, like, again, in the internet, like if I have a website, but you know, someone browsing the internet can't click on a link to easily, quickly just like pull up my website and interact with it, then I'm kind of in my own isolated island. So we're kind of in this pre-hyperlink era almost, or like pre-browser era, where it's very difficult for people to move between different chains. And so that's one of the problems of and unfortunately right now, the way that rollups work is when you deploy a new rollup, you're functionally kind of an isolated island to some degree. So I think, fortunately, there's a lot of great progress happening on that front. We have these intent-based solutions which make cross-chain interoperability very fast from a user perspective. We're getting better and better proof systems for rollups that are going to make the settlement between rollups significantly faster as well. And Celestia specifically is working on something called lazy bridging, which is a essentially, you can think of it as bundling sort of settlement-like features to Celestia that enable one-click user interactions between chains in the Celestia ecosystem to sort of unify the liquidity and the applications for users, so that it starts. So even though each application might be a different chain, to a user, it feels like one cohesive ecosystem. And so in the long term, it will feel like each roll up, you don't notice that they're in separate chains. It's sort of like, we also have this saying of the modular mullet, where it's like chain abstraction in the front, and then all this like modular blockchain infrastructure in the back. And the chain abstraction part is basically what I was describing of, you know, when you use the internet, you don't actually know everything that's happening in the background. You don't understand necessarily how you're securely talking to all these servers, and how you're moving information between all these different applications, and how that all that plumbing works is abstracted away from you. And eventually, and quite soon, I think, all that complexity will also be abstracted away from users of blockchains.
That's a very interesting point, because I got a question about ZK bridging. I know blobs, the premium of blobs next to Celestia is composability. That's what the ETH community push. You know, like being on the same DA as the L1, you got all the composability between all rollups. Do you think lazy bridging can compete with that? Can, you know, give the same result?
Yeah, I think it can. And in fact, in some ways it might be slightly better, because so basically, like Celestia, so the thing about how Ethereum, you know, has been built from the beginning is that Ethereum was originally a monolithic chain with all execution living on the L1 as smart contracts. Celestia had the ability to start from scratch with this new modular architecture. And so we were able to sort of leapfrog and avoid having all this monolithic baggage on the layer one. And initially, it seemed like one of the downsides of not having execution on the layer one would be that we couldn't provide this service of helping to coordinate bridging within the ecosystem on Celestia. But the thing is, the progress of ZK proofs and this whole idea behind lazy bridging, of like, one of the core ideas behind it was this concept of a ZK account, where Celestia could essentially provide that functionality without adding execution. So we're able, what that means is, and why I said this could be even better than Ethereum, is that like, we're able to provide the same set of, like, same value proposition in terms of like helping coordinate between different rollups, but without the overhead, the added overhead that Ethereum has. And so another reason it could be better is that Celestia has faster block times and faster finality times. And that helps with bridging, both from, if you're bridging from to and from an external chain like Ethereum or Solana. So like lazy bridging, by the way, is not just about between the rollups on Celestia. The Celestia L1 also will have bridges to, you know, chains and assets like Bitcoin, Solana, Ethereum. And so it kind of can become this hub through which a rollup can access the whole universe of liquidity. And so anyway, the block times, the Celestia's fast block times and fast finality means that the interoperability between all these different chains can happen more quickly. Ethereum has a little bit more of a like slower time to finality and slower block times.
Okay, just to get back to DA, you know, it was a very big narrative last year, modularity, modular March. It was really hot. Right now, not that much. I think a lot of people seeing Solana performing, you know. I think monolithic have taken more space. Why do you think this happened? Do you think modality have a bright future?
Yeah. So I think that modularity is the future. And if you're actually, it's still early, but if you're tracking the actual trend of where people are building and the most exciting, ambitious projects are choosing, like the architecture that they're choosing to build on top of, it's almost all universally on top of some form of modular architecture. So a few examples of this are, recently we announced that Converge, which is the Athena and Securitize sort of tokenized and institutional DeFi chain called Converge, is building on top of Celestia and Arbitrum. And the reason they're doing that is that, like, they have this really big vision of like building this institutional DeFi chain, tokenizing like real world assets. There's also a DEX that's being built on top of that called Ethereal. And the only way they could see it functionally working is if they built it as a full stack application, for two reasons. One is they needed to have specific permissions and customizations for that use case. And the second is they needed extreme performance and throughput. And they couldn't build that on a Solana. It's not so there's two reasons. One is Solana just may not have enough throughput for them if they really scale and they're sharing the same chain as you know, all these other applications, then they could just run into throughput issues and congestion, and they just don't want to have that. Celestia offers them orders of magnitude, like you can run, as I said, multiple Solanas on top of Celestia, right? And they could be dedicated to your application. And then the other thing is that if they want those full stack permissions and the independence and the control of being an independent chain, you can't do that as a smart contract on top of Solana. And so it made sense for them to build on a high performance full stack application, like infrastructure suite of products, which is Celestia and Arbitrum. So that is an example of, like, we're going to see more and more of all of these. Like, if you have a really ambitious, big vision for what you're going to build, there's I think there's almost no way that you end up building it as a smart contract. Or even if you do, it could make sense to build it as a smart contract initially. So let's say, hey, this is kind of a new idea. I want to prototype it. I want to tap into an ecosystem, like a general purpose chain like Solana, or I don't know, some other general purpose chain to get distribution. That makes sense. Like I could see, hey, I have a new idea for a DEX or a new DeFi protocol. Let's deploy it initially on Solana and see how that goes. But if you actually reach a critical mass of the application being successful, having a number of users, you're going to start to hit bottlenecks that can only be solved by moving to your own chain. So first of all, you're going to want, as I said, to customize things. Maybe there's like a certain precompiles, or you need to customize aspects of your execution to enable you to make the actual product a better user experience, or enable new features. Maybe you need to add privacy. Maybe you need to, maybe you want to change the way that accounts work so you can abstract away gas from the end user, or you want to change the cryptography so that you can have a very specific embedded wallet that makes user onboarding super smooth. You're going to need to migrate to your own infrastructure for that. As far as you're going to need to build a full stack rollup based application. The other thing is you might run into, actually a big one also for DeFi, frankly, is sequencing. There's a really big motivation for lots of DeFi applications to move to their own chain so that they can control the sequencing of their application to either capture MEV or to redirect the MEV to their users, or to just enable, for example, like Hyperliquid is a good example of this. You know, they made it more favorable for market makers so that they can enhance the liquidity on their platform. So a lot of these things are things you can only do on your own chain. And then the second thing is, if you want to go bigger with your application, once it's successful, you're going to want to have more throughput. You're going to want to have dedicated block space. You're not going to want to share block space with the other applications on a chain like Solana, because the congestion can start to affect you. So essentially, I think of like a Solana or these general purpose chains as actually launch pads for application specific chains. And we're seeing this happen in real time. Like multiple successful Solana based projects are all launching their own chains. Lots of the most successful Ethereum applications are launching their own rollups. And so this is just a trend that's very obvious for people who are paying attention. I think that it could take a while for people to actually wake up to that reality. But to me, it's like the future is already kind of here, but it's just not evenly distributed. And that's also why I think there's a massive information asymmetry in the market, and an opportunity for people who are actually paying attention to capture that.
Yeah, because if you look at Converge, it's like it's a L2, but they never said it, in no communication around, because they lose too much premium.
Oh, I just want to make a point on that. Even calling something an L2, no one cares. What it is an application. To me, there's two categories of things you could build in crypto, roughly. One is like this. One is you can try to be an L1, which is what I call a security zone, which is it's a place that provides security and interoperability and block space for people to run applications. Or you can try to build an application. Now, everyone's obsessed with this L2, L1 jargon, but like no one cares. And L2s have a bad name just because of historical biases, and L1s have a premium also for whatever historical biases. But if like that's all it is just security zones and applications. And so Converge is an application. Doesn't matter that they're a roll up or L2 or whatever. Celestia is a security zone. But yeah, it's helpful for people to can just realize that Celestia is an L1, just like Solana or Ethereum. A lot of people get that wrong. Anyway, sorry for the rant.
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. So yeah, talking about DA, I love the thesis around DA is the next Blockspace, because Blockspace was really scarce back then. There were a lot of demand. So where are we? Do you think that's a viable business? How much could be the demand of DA actually?
Yeah, great question again. So I'll just preface this too, because I think this kind of goes back to a little bit your previous question of data availability was really exciting and hot a couple of years ago, and now people are less excited about it. Well, there's always this cyclicality to blockchain infrastructure in general, where when there's a bull market and there's a lot of people using Blockspace, transacting, using applications, then people all of a sudden start to care about scalability and throughput, because that's when you're actually starting to run into the throughput and scaling challenges, right? So you saw this in 2017 with something like CryptoKitties. You saw this in 2021 when there were outages on Solana, and Ethereum gas prices were skyrocketing and things like that, right? All of a sudden people realize, oh wow, well, what the infrastructure that we have is not enough for what we need. And so, but then when you're in a bear market, very few people are really transacting on chain compared to other times. And so people will just feel like, oh well, we don't really need more block space. Why should we really care, right? I think of taking a step back, addressing the question of well, what is the TAM, like the total addressable market for block space? And you're right, data availability is just another word for block space. So what Celestia is, and that's an end product of every L1, is like this secure block space for people to transact and build applications and interact with applications. So basically that question is like, what is the demand for block space? Is like, what is the TAM for crypto and Web3 and like as an industry? And I think that also in bear markets, people start to think, well, nothing's really working. No one's using anything. You know, the TAM of crypto is small. And I've been seeing this a lot on Twitter lately, where people are just like, oh, there's, you know, even Anatoly from Solana recently was saying there's only about 6 smart contracts that matter. There's only like really 6 applications for blockchains. Everything else is not going to work. And other people who are just saying like, you know what, all crypto is going to be is a place for speculation, is a, you know, place to gamble, and that's it. Like no one's actually going to use this stuff. And I think both of those are like supremely pessimistic. And we always see that in bear markets where people just get pessimistic. Whereas in the bull market, everyone gets really excited. They're like, oh my God, NFTs are the future. We're going to have the metaverse. We're going to fucking, you know, put all of the, you know, finance on chain. And I tend to think that the bull market mania is actually right long term. It's just that we always have higher expectations than where things go. Like our timeline is too short. We're always like,
Yeah.
oh man, you know, in the next year everything's just going to blow up and it's going to be up only. The thing is, like, if you zoom out for 10 years, I think it's very, very plausible that we get to those future things. So I personally think we will move a majority of like global finance and payments on chain over 10 plus years. I think we will see the emergence of metaverse and like on-chain gaming and these like virtual worlds online over the next 10 years. I think we are going to see things like decentralized social media where users have more control over their like feeds. They have more control over their data, and control over their identities. I think we're going to see things like the verifiable web, where we have unstoppable domain registries. We have just like some of the core components and plumbing of the internet itself will be running on chain as a way to make it more secure and decentralized. Things like certificate authorities are going to move to decentralized versions of themselves. So I think DePIN also, I mean, like there's all these like really exciting long-term massive use cases where you could see literally everyone in the world using blockchains on a daily basis for a lot of their digital financial life. And so if you believe in that, then the TAM for Blockspace is going to be millions of TPS, right? And if you back that up of like, okay, millions of TPS, how much block space do we need for that? Well, you need like a gigabyte on the order of a gigabyte per second of DA throughput of block space. And so, and honestly, I don't know, we could be underestimating it, but that's where, so Celestia's roadmap is targeting that level of throughput, because the other thing about all this that's so tricky is that you want to have the supply of like the demand for block space can grow exponentially overnight over the course of a month or 6 months, right? You can go from no one transacting, you have an application that goes absolutely viral, and all of a sudden overnight you need 100x the throughput. And so, you know, in previous cycles we've seen that happen, and then all these chains reach their limit, like Ethereum or Solana or whatever. And that's also one of the things that caps the growth of these applications and puts the damper on these bull markets, is like, well, they just reach a limit where they can't really scale beyond that. And so Celestia is trying to, even if the block space is not full right now, build enough block space so that when and as these applications actually take shape and come to the market, we're there to actually provide the throughput when that ramp up happens. So that's why Celestia is scaling so aggressively, and that's why, I mentioned the Mammoth one testnet that we released has 21 megabytes of throughput, which is, again, is like something like on the order of like 20x Solana, right? And like, there's not that you could fit all of the existing blockchain throughput on that easily. But we still want to scale more because we want to be ready for that incoming wave of what we feel is kind of inevitable demand for Blockspace. So that's the way that I think about it. And we can talk more about like what are the economics of Blockspace for a protocol, because I think that's another thing that people also get hung up on.
Actually, I'm trying to write an article about DA, and I'm trying to find some data around the demand for DA. I can't find anything. Do you know if there is some research paper around this potential?
I don't know of any research paper, but there are dashboards, so I can send you a few links. So there's like Blockworks has a great dashboard that I think is now public on Celestia, so you can see the demand for Blockspace over time and the fees and things like that. There's also celestiadata.com. There's Numia is a platform that has a bunch of data. There's a whole full list. I can send that to you.
Rollup.wtf also.
Oh yeah, rollup.wtf is good. I think even L2Beat has some basic stuff. So that's a good place to go there. But again, I don't know how much, in some ways, thinking about like demand, like DA is a forward-looking thing. So I don't know how much you can glean from. You kind of have to take a bet on how bullish you are on these things that I was mentioning. Is like how much do you think people will be wanting to use blockchains in the future?
All right. And I've seen a lot of debate around DA being a commodity. I personally think Blockspace is a commodity. It loses its premium over time, it loses its price. Do you think DA is a commodity? Do you think in 5-10 years DA will be worth not much?
I absolutely disagree that DA is a commodity. So think about like, what are blockchains? Blockchains are networks. They are networks of computers. And they're also, so they're a network of computers running a specific software that enables, like a protocol, enables them to talk to each other and create this secure on-chain environment where you can enforce rules, right? You can't double spend. You can't just mint money. And so there's already a network effect just in the essence of what a blockchain is, of like a bunch of computers running a specific kind of software. Blockchains are also a network of applications, in that you deploy an application on top of a specific chain, and depending on which chain you deploy that application on, it can interoperate with other applications on that chain, that security zone, with greater degree of security and fidelity. And so there's also this network effect of, as more valuable applications are co-located on one specific security zone, there becomes this greater and greater network effect. Like each next application that's deciding where to deploy is going to look at that and say, wow, well, if everyone's already over there, and if by deploying on that security zone, that L1, like Celestia, let's say, I can get this benefit, I'm going to deploy there. And again, with each net new application that deploys there, that value proposition gets stronger and stronger. So that's like the definition of a network effect. So maybe to explain a little bit more what I mean by that, and this notion of a security zone, because I think that's kind of like one of the core parts of explaining this network effect, is when so people are really obsessed right now, or have been obsessed with this idea of interoperability or like composability between applications, right? This is something that Solana talks a lot about, which is like, well, if you deploy your application on Solana, you can compose very effectively. And the reason is like they want to have synchronous composability, meaning that the applications, basically from a user perspective, it all just happens in one synchronous atomic interaction. And the liquidity is not fragmented, and basically a lot of the things that we're talking about of the challenges of rollups that currently gets solved by building your application as a smart contract on a shared execution layer like Solana. In the future, as we were talking about, with chain abstraction and better interoperability, the importance for synchronous composability will go down and eventually, I think, be de minimis, because there's very few things that you can build that require synchronous composability. What you do want to have is two things. You want to have atomic composability, and you want to have, and so what I mean by that, atomic composability is that if I perform an action on this chain, I want to make sure that basically these two applications can't end up in a state where I tried to do something and then my funds got stuck and didn't actually go through and complete the interaction that I was trying to do. And in order to do that, what you need to share is not a shared execution layer. You need to share a common consensus layer. And so Celestia is a common consensus layer for its applications. So it solves that problem. Then what you want is secure interoperability, which is you want to make sure that when I'm this application and I have this state, and I see this other application that has this state, we need to be able to read from each other's state in a secure way, so that you didn't just mint a bunch of fake tokens and you don't just rug all of my liquidity that I bridged over to you, or vice versa. And that happens via proofs, essentially, in a roll-up centric way. And so, but in order for that, also the last thing is that for that secure interoperability to take place, you also need to share data availability. So you need to share, you need to be able to verify that the data behind each of those chains, those applications, has been published. So that's, again, Celestia provides you the core primitives to have this very secure interoperability. And so that is sort of the core value proposition of what Celestia is this place not only to run your application in a way that, you know, users and whatnot can verify, but also so that other applications can verify and interact with. So the network effects, I think it's very clear that like Ethereum L1 or Solana L1 have network effects, right? There's a reason why people want to deploy there. And I think that Celestia has the exact same ones. It's just at a different order of abstraction, where it's not network effects around shared execution. It's network effects around shared security and high fidelity, high economic bandwidth interoperability between applications. So again, data availability and consensus, which is what Celestia offers, and this notion of Blockspace, has very strong network effects. And it's not going to be the case that like just because someone spins up a new DA layer or like copies Celestia and deploys a new thing that has all this throughput, that Blockspace is going to be the same as this Blockspace over here, with all these applications, all this state that you can securely interoperate with if you deploy there. So that's the way that I see it. And that's why I don't think that it's a commodity. Now, just a note, which is that it's clear that the value of this interoperability has a limit, in the sense of when Ethereum was charging, I don't know, hundreds of dollars for each megabyte of call data, like this is in 2023, there's a lot of rollups who were like, you know what, we're paying millions of dollars to be deployed on Ethereum. And sure, we like the security. We like the fact that we can interoperate more securely with the Ethereum ecosystem. But frankly, it's just not worth paying that much. So a lot of them migrated, for example, to Celestia DA or wherever, some other, or they found some other way to solve their problem. And I think, so I guess my point is I'm not saying that data availability and Blockspace is going to have network effects that are so strong that, you can charge an exorbitant amount of money for people to run their applications. But my point is that, commodity would mean that the margin that you can charge on top of the actual cost of production of the block space would be very, very small. And I think the margin will actually be probably significant enough that when you have the scale of throughput that we're talking about, which is like, gigabytes per second of DA throughput, the overall revenue / like profits of a protocol that has that level of demand will be substantial.
Okay, I see. And talking about Ethereum, there is a very hot debate about who is going to win the DA layer battle. Do you think blobs have so much premium? Are you going because I think a lot of layer 2 use or application, as you said, use blobs because of the Ethereum alignment philosophy. Do you think in the future blobs have a place next to Celestia, which is faster, cheaper, and built for it?
So I think Ethereum blobs were a significant step forward for the Ethereum ecosystem. Like before that, when everything was on call data, the throughput was super limited. And so blobs have been huge in terms of removing that bottleneck. However, I don't think it's been enough to actually meet the demand for data availability and block space. And so, and even I think for the current scaling roadmap as it exists for Ethereum, the throughput for blobs is not going to be able to keep up with the demand. And so that's why I think we're seeing an increasing number of these chains, like let's say Converge, for example, deploying on Celestia, because they need to know that there's going to be adequate throughput for their app. They don't want to deploy somewhere. And let's say that blobs is fine for now.
Yeah.
But Converge gets a lot of traction, and all of a sudden they're saturating all of the Ethereum blob space. All of a sudden the fees start to go up, and now they're paying millions of dollars to run their chain. That's not a good outcome for them. So they're going to be conservative and deploy somewhere like Celestia, where they can see there's a ton of excess throughput. There's a very robust scaling roadmap, and they can feel very confident that there's going to be adequate block space for them to run their application. So I think that Celestia is sort of like the place where that's also where I feel like Celestia and Ethereum are kind of just frankly just different things. Like I don't think of them as competitive because they're just frankly different animals altogether. Like Ethereum started out as a monolithic chain. They started to pursue this roll-up roadmap. So they added DA to their overall architecture. Now they're even in simultaneous with scaling the block space, they're going and scaling the L1 execution, right? So they're kind of like a monolithic chain. And Solana is like monolithic, Ethereum is monolithic, and Celestia is like just a pure modular layer 1, only doing DA, not scaling execution on the L1. And for that reason, the levels of throughput that we have, I think we're already probably like 50x or something.
Yeah.
I think blob throughput. And if Mammoth 1, if we did that, we would be, hundreds of X the throughput of Ethereum blobs. So again, we're just a totally different entity and thing. and will be used by different teams with different needs. You know, I think there's still going to be a lot of reason some people will want to deploy on Blockspace because they value the Ethereum level of security. They value interoperating and being part of this Ethereum security zone. So that's the way that I see it. I also want to mention another team that we're super bullish on called Abstract, which will be migrating to Celestia DA soon. And like just like Converge,
Really?
Huh?
Wow.
Sorry?
I didn't know. They move because they don't have enough space on blobs, right?
Yeah, well, we've been working on an integration with them for a while. They're on the ZK Sync stack, and we are working on an integration to help them migrate over. And it should go live relatively soon. And essentially, one of the interesting things that happened last week or very recently was Abstract had a spike in usage, and they saturated the blob space on Ethereum. And for like a few hours, they were paying, I can't remember, but a ton of money to post on blobs. Because again, as soon as you saturate the throughput, it becomes this demand spike pricing mechanism that easily the prices of blob space can just skyrocket. And anyway, that's why they want to migrate to Celestia DA, is because they want to avoid exactly that thing happening. So it was kind of interesting that it did happen. And so it just kind of solidifies why they're making that transition, and how on Celestia, if they had the same thing, like as the amount of like the demand spike that they went through, which wasn't even that high compared to what they want to build the future of like consumer crypto, right? They want to be like kind of like the AOL of crypto. Like AOL onboarded all these people to the internet for the first time because they made it super user friendly. They built these applications that consumer users actually resonated with, right? And so if they're going to be successful in that, they're going to onboard millions of people. That little demand spike that they saw, which saturated Ethereum block space, is like 1/1000th of where they want to go. So that's why they need to be on somewhere like Celestia. Like even if Ethereum scales up by like 4x or 5x or 10x, that's still not enough. They need something that's 1000x better. That's what Celestia is. So that's another like example of where I feel like this ambitious team, this ambitious project is choosing Celestia because that's the only thing that could actually supply what they need.
Okay, very interesting. Talking about another competitor, or a real competitor, actually, EigenDA, you know, it have a bit of advantage because it's an AVS, so it's very performant. I think Mega if use it because of that. What's the premium of Celestia next to EigenDA?
Yeah, great question. So EigenDA is frankly, I don't think that they have any. I think their throughput advantage is mostly narrative, if not all narrative, essentially, especially at this point. They claim to do 15 megabytes per second of DA throughput. No one's actually seen that on a test net. Everything is completely permissioned. So if you want to use EigenDA, there's no like node. You can't just like permissionlessly post data there. You have to actually fill out a Google form and get whitelisted. So, you know, it's hard to take a product like that seriously, and take their claims seriously. And Mammoth 1, which is a public testnet that we published, has 21 megabytes per second of throughput, which is already more than what EigenDA has. So I don't actually think that they have any real advantage when it comes to the throughput. And what we've heard, at least from customers and people who have tried to integrate and work with their stack, is that it's just far less mature and far less reliable and stable. So people who are actually like making these choices, like there's a reason why, if you look, for example, on L2Beat, there's almost no there are almost no users on EigenDA, right? There's no one's building there because it's just an inferior product. And so that's why I think of EigenDA as like primarily narrative. There was actually a tweet earlier today from Sam Batinelli, who is building Rise, which is like a kind of the equivalent to Mega ETH. It's a based high performance EVM chain. Super bullish about it. And he was saying, he explored EigenDA and Celestia for 6 months, like very intensely. And they decided to build on Celestia because, well, he mentioned a few key things. One is the tech is more mature. So as I was mentioning, he said the integration was far, far smoother, and their dev support and operations was mountains above EigenDA. The second one he mentions is like Celestia consistently hits their scaling targets. So like we have a public roadmap of like how we're going to scale, and we have stuck to that and shipped. Like we have been shipping upgrades to mainnet every quarter that consistently level up our throughput each time. And I think that just gives them a lot of confidence that we're going to continue to ship. I haven't seen. I mean, whatever EigenDA is shipping is not as like, I guess like public, or it's harder to like have confidence, I guess, over their like shipping their roadmap and actually scaling. And the last thing was like security. This is actually a huge note. So Celestia has this thing called Blobstream, and in general has like a native asset that is staked to the DA layer. And so if you want to be in Ethereum L2, the value that you're securing on that bridge, you want to have that very secure. And EigenDA, until they allow native Eigen staking, they only have Ethereum staking. And Ethereum staking for DA, it's a long thing. You can read this on L2Beat, but you can't stake Ethereum to secure a DA layer. So basically, there also is no slashing as well. Maybe they actually shipped that recently. I can't remember. But essentially, there's no actual economic security for EigenDA as it stands right now. So where Celestia has like billions of dollars staked, so the security is just like completely different. So anyway, like I think that kind of gives a high level summary of the differences between Celestia and EigenDA.
What is the game in DA layer? Are you giving grants, to reach some application? How does that work? Or are they coming to you?
Yeah, it's funny because I've seen FUD on Twitter, which is saying like, oh, Celestia has to pay, it's just totally paying for every chain that deploys on them, and it's all fake demand and things like that. This couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, I will say, there are teams that are grant farmers that come to you and they're like, hey, we're talking to all these other chains, convince us to build on you by paying us. Like, they don't say it directly that way, but that's basically what it comes down to, is like, look, we can build on all these things. We don't really care. So we're going to go with whoever pays us the most. That is explicitly, it shows their true colors and their true cards, in the sense of they don't actually care about the product. If they care about the product, the Celestia is in a league of its own. There's no DA layer, there's no L1 that comes close to what Celestia offers. Nowhere. There's not even it's not even a competition. And so oftentimes the best teams who actually have a big vision, they're ambitious, they want to win, if you think about it, what matters most to them is building their best product. And to do that, they need to build on the best DA product, the best DA layer, which is Celestia. And they need that for the reasons that we were just talking about, which is like they want to have the reliability, the security, the throughput, all these things that only Celestia can offer. And so those are the teams that we like to work with. The ones who aren't, the conversation is not like, hey, how much are you going to pay me? It's, wow, let's talk about what does Celestia enable? How does it compare? Okay, we're gonna prototype this. Like look at Rise. They spent 6 months evaluating EigenDA versus Celestia. They chose Celestia because not because there's some grant. They chose Celestia because the product, the tech, is orders of magnitude better. And so essentially what I'm trying to say is like the grant farmer type of builders tend to be the ones that are also building low quality products at the end of the day. And so, yeah, that's something that we actively try to minimize in basically growing our ecosystem. Other thing is like when you pay for users, that actually actively sort of kneecaps your own ability to evaluate if your product is competitive or not. It can paper over, like that can be a strategy that helps in the short term. Like you can get a little bit of adoption and things like that. But in the long term, if you don't win based on your product, then you're playing a game that eventually things will catch up to you and you'll fail. You're kind of papering over your real problems in a way that I think sets you up for failure down the road. So it's something we actively avoid. And the way that we bootstrap a lot of our early ecosystem also was frankly from just being the category creator, the category leader, me and other folks on the team doing things that don't scale, one-on-one, recruiting founders and builders that we really liked, dedicating engineering resources to help finish the integration and make sure that everything worked, working with them to do co-marketing and co-branding and help them grow their own ecosystem, their own awareness. And these are all things that like matter to builders much more than grant money if they actually want to win. And so that's where I think our team excels, is like not just on the product side, but also on the ecosystem support level. I mean, I guess that's also what Sam was saying in his thing, was just how like Celestia, he says the dev support and operations was mountains above EigenDA at that time. So that's a quote from his tweet. So he's kind of like touching on that, the fact that like the level of support is just on a different level. So anyway, that's what I think about it. I mean, Eclipse, for example, how did we get Eclipse? Was when Luna and Terra melted down in 2022. There were all these dev teams and good founders building that ecosystem who I didn't know what to do next. I messaged a bunch of people, happened to connect with this guy named Neil, who was building something, and we convinced him to build on top of Celestia. Fast forward, 3 years, 2.5 years, Eclipse actually shipped something. We didn't that's not something that we had to pay for. It was like literally 2 years of ongoing business development and support, co-marketing and branding. So that's like, I think a lot of people don't want to believe that Celestia is actually an organic ecosystem. But it is, and probably to a degree more than almost all other ecosystems other than like Solana or Ethereum, I would say. Like there are, having been in the market, I can tell you that there are a lot of ecosystems that win their customers via massive grants. So that does exist. So, but I'm telling you, Celestia is not one of those projects. That's not, we just see that as a losing strategy and an adverse selection.
Okay, very interesting. And if we talk a bit about, so we talked about adoption, can we talk about revenue? I heard Mustafa saying that fees are like very, very low just to avoid spam. let's say you don't need to bring that for competitive to be competitive. How much would you earn, and how much do you expect to earn, like in the next few years? And also, are you going to raise the fee? I know it was a debate a few weeks ago.
Yeah. So glad we're touching on this, because this is another thing. It relates to this whole DA as a commodity thing that we talked about, and the overall demand for DA, right? Which is like, what is the revenue model, the business model, I guess, of like Celestia as a protocol? And the first thing, and so a lot of people look at Celestia's current fees, and they extrapolate from that, and they say, wow, well, even with this amount of demand of transaction volume on Celestia, the fees will be too small to make meaningful revenue. And this is, there's two ways in which people get this wrong. The first is they extrapolate that based on the current fee, which is, we essentially set the fees at the beginning to roughly zero. They're just barely above zero. I think they're 100x cheaper than Ethereum blobs. And Ethereum blobs, by the way, are already dirt cheap. And the reason they're set to basically zero is because we're trying to subsidize demand. We needed to have some fee for spam prevention, right? So we don't want to just let anyone just post blobs and spam the network. So there needs to be a non-zero fee. But beyond that, Celestia's focus right now is not to make money, to make revenue, right? If you look at some of the most successful like internet businesses, they have all prioritized in the early years, if not like the first 10 years almost, growth. So look at Amazon. Famously, Jeff Bezos never prioritized revenue or profit, or if any money that they were making was reinvested back into the business, right? And so the reason they did that is so that they could scale to dominate e-commerce. That's what they wanted to do. And focusing prematurely on revenue was going to actually take away from their ability to grow to what they've now become, which is absolutely this massive e-commerce platform, right? The biggest in the world. And so in a network effects based sort of like business or dynamic, which I think blockchains are, this L1 security zone, if you're trying to win at the L1 security zone, you want to bootstrap these network effects. And you do that by growing as fast and as big as possible. And so Celestia is intentionally keeping the fees low so we can grow faster and so that we can enable people to experiment, with these new applications. Like we don't want people to be thinking like, oh, I could launch this new chain, this new app, but I don't have the funding to pay for, thousands of dollars a month in DA fees. We want people to be like, yeah, I'm going to YOLO and just build this crazy thing and see if it works or not. And just not be constrained by thinking about the costs. Now, obviously, eventually in the future, getting to like your question, I think in the future, there will have to be a moment where the fees increase because it's not sustainable for Celestia to just be letting everyone use the protocol for free. But I don't see that moment coming anytime soon. And it'll be interesting to know. It'll be interesting at that point to see where the price point and equilibrium for Blockspace lands up, because right now it's like 0, and then you have like 100x, and that's Ethereum blobs. Maybe it'll end up being like 10x where they are today, or maybe 50x or 100x. I don't know, but like even at like I think even at 50 or 100x of where the fees are today, the end user transaction fees on Celestia will be less than Solana. the average fee or the median fee for a user on Solana. So like we have a tremendous amount of room to increase the fees without actually impacting end users. I don't see any end users complaining about, oh, the Solana fees are too high. And so there's a huge amount of room to increase the fees at some point. But again, yeah, that's not necessarily a priority.
Just rapidly, Memo 1 is hitting testnet. When can we expect Mainnet to come?
Great question. So we are rolling out a so Memo 1 is a public testnet. We have 2 other public testnets that are sort of in the pipeline to mainnet deployment. Right now, we're about to go through with a V4 upgrade, which has a bunch of things in it. I think there's going to be a blog post coming out about that very soon. And so I would expect in the next upgrade for there to be more throughput increases. I don't expect us to go directly to Mammo 1, but I do expect I would expect Mammo 1 to hit mainnet well before the end of the year. And we will have at least another 4x in throughput probably before the end of Q2 is my guess. So yeah, we're gonna have, and I think also, by the way, the cool thing about Mammo 1 is that part of what's powering Mammo 1 is this exciting new sort of like block propagation design that one of our core engineers, Evan, who's been with the project for over 4 years too, and total just Chad when it comes to scaling and just consensus and data availability. He designed this thing called Vacuum, and we were able to get the Mammo throughput numbers just by, he only implemented like half or less than half of the Vacuum implementation. So there's like this other half to implement and optimize that I think will even give us a whole nother, order of magnitude of throughput. So anyway, all that's to say that I expect Mammo 1 to come to mainnet before the end of the year easily. And I expect probably more throughput, even higher throughput test nets to come out over the next 6 months or so that even go beyond what Mammo 1 can do. Now, the truth is that once we have something like Mammo 1 on mainnet, I think the throughput of Celestia is going to be so enormously high that in some ways, it could make more sense from a product perspective to also start focusing on some certain other priorities, such as we want to drop block times more. Block times are currently at 6 seconds, but we would love to get them, down to the sub-second level. So we could maybe see shifting more of the engineering focus towards like decreasing latency, because that's a key thing for interoperability, user experience, and base rollups and things like that.
Okay. And if we go like 5 years in the future, what's your vision? What's your dream about Celestia and about your roadmap to 1 giga gas second? When do you think you'll reach it?
Yeah, the North Star we started out with like a year ago was we want to have gigabyte blocks. Now I think so that would be around 100 megabytes per second of throughput, which we're only, frankly, with Mammo 1 4x away. So it's kind of crazy that we're almost already in less than a year at that target that we set out. And so kind of what we're thinking about is like, maybe the real North Star or the updated North Star could be 1 gigabyte per second of throughput, which isn't like another 10x higher. And again, that's when you hit the level of like 1 million TPS kind of number, which sounds like science fiction, but I think is actually achievable. And I think we will get there well before, like, maybe in like 2 years or less than that. Definitely not 5 years. Maybe by 5 years we're multiple gigabytes per second at that point. So that's at least from an engineering standpoint. Also, I think in like a couple of years, we can be in sub-second block times. Maybe our latency is not too far from what Solana is today, you know, a few hundred milliseconds. So that would be huge. But from, I think more interestingly is like the other aspects like lazy bridging and just chain abstraction and interoperability. I think in a couple of years, it's very possible that you won't know that under the hood, there are all these different chains. Like the Celestia ecosystem will feel very cohesive. And the ability to move funds and for users to interact with all these different applications under the hood will feel extremely seamless. So that's something that we actually have a demo of lazy bridging and what this can look like coming out this quarter, which I think will also kind of like help illustrate that. But yeah, and then, you know, beyond all the actual protocol and engineering things, like 5 years from now or over the coming years, we want to solidify Celestia as the dominant, you know, security provider, like L1 for people who are building the most ambitious applications. So these teams like Converge or like Abstract, etc. We want to onboard significantly more of these kinds of teams who are pushing the frontier of what's possible on chain, who have a big vision of onboarding millions of users, creating applications that people use every day. And a lot of the things that we talked about earlier on this podcast of what's the big vision behind crypto?
Yeah.
You know, like on-chain finance and payments, metaverse and gaming things like DePIN, things like decentralized social media and decentralized internet. Like we want to be building with the teams who have the vision for all the biggest ideas for what blockchain and Web3 should be. And we want that to be being built on Celestia. And I think, frankly, as of right now, there's nowhere else that can actually house those kind of applications with that level of vision.
Okay, amazing. We are reaching the end of the interview. I just got like 2 questions first. Is there a subject I missed you want to talk about, you know, express yourself? I don't know.
I don't think so. I mean, I thought it was really good. You got, you know, had a lot of the best questions. We touched on almost everything that I can think of. So
okay, perfect. Thanks. And yeah, I like to have one last question for the invitee. So not for Celestia, for Nick, you know. I like to follow like big brains on City and know what they like. I know you like things like Initial or something like this. I just want you to, you know, talk about what do you like outside of Celestia? What in the space, you know?
Yeah, I am super bullish on stable coins and payments. I mean, I think that payments is the most obvious and first use case that we should be able to nail as an industry, because it's so simple. And now we're getting the stablecoin regulation that we need to like make all these upgrades to the, you know, the banking system. And so and even, you know, there are legacy financial institutions who are like now actively like pursuing this, like MasterCard and Visa upgrading their payments with stablecoins, or Stripe, etc. And so I'm really bullish on that. I think there's also some really interesting like crypto native payments applications. Like one is called Pay, Payy. They have a big announcement coming out soon. They're building on Celestia, but essentially it's like this kind of like a crypto native Venmo. And you download the app, and you would have no idea that you're using a blockchain in a good way, in the sense of like there's no private key at the store. There's your wallet is automatically backed up in iCloud or basically cloud storage. It uses Face ID and your secure enclave natively on your phone. But you would know that you're using blockchain because of the features that it has. So it has the ability to pay anyone instantly with stablecoins anywhere in the world. And it's not like, if I use Venmo, it's like, oh, well, you're in France. I can't send you money because my bank doesn't talk to your bank, and so it completely gets around that problem. And on top of that, the beautiful thing is that it doesn't just stop with payments. They want to build a whole on-chain banking infrastructure where I have my stablecoins on pay and I'm earning yield just automatically by either holding a yield-bearing stablecoin under the hood, or maybe there's some kind of DeFi activities that I can participate in. So it's kind of like, when people were using CeFi, like people forget that in 2021, a lot of these CeFi applications like Celsius or BlockFi were extremely successful. We can basically now build on-chain versions of that are trust minimized and secure. Then they're not gonna blow up on you and rug all your money, and you can earn all this extra money through yield by participating in DeFi and holding yield-bearing stablecoins. And you can pay anyone in the world. Like these things are actually coming to fruition, I would say, over the next few years. And so I'm just frankly super bullish on that. RWAs and tokenizing assets like Converge is something that I think is bullish. Like there's another chain that we're working with called Noble, which I encourage everyone to check out. They start out with a yield bearing stablecoin, but now they're building this Noble application layer, which is essentially, going beyond just asset issuance into like, how do we build, DeFi related applications that leverage these real world assets and stable coins. So that's a category I'm really bullish on. I guess I could probably keep going, but I don't want to bore you guys. But that's a handful of things that I'm pretty excited about.
Ok, thanks, that's very interesting. Merci du coup d'avoir regardé l'interview. Si jamais vous voulez en savoir plus sur Celestia, vous pouvez suivre le compte X de Celestia, vous avez le site, et puis allez suivre Nick White, il a plein de trucs très intéressants à dire sur le CT. Thanks Nick White for coming, it was really nice. And I hope the best for Celestia. I hope DA is going to be big. We have a lot of application. I really dream about that. So hope the best for you.
It will be. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.